On the morning of February 3rd, 1945, Helga Schneider stood frozen at the entrance of the mess hall at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, unable to process the aroma wafting through the air. The 26-year-old former auxiliary of the Wehrmacht Women's Corps inhaled deeply, her mind racing to identify the familiar yet impossible scent. Butter, sugar, something sweet and comforting that reminded her of childhood. Before the war, before the hunger. Pancakes, American pancakes with maple syrup, being served on ordinary metal trays to German women prisoners, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her hands trembled slightly as an American serviceman gestured for her to move forward in the line. "They serve this to prisoners?" she whispered to Margaret Voss, another German woman who had arrived with her 2 days earlier. What Helga saw before her defied 6 years of indoctrination about American barbarity, materialism, and inevitable economic collapse. The Reich's Ministry of Propaganda had prepared her for torture, starvation, and humiliation as a prisoner of war in America. Instead, she faced the incomprehensible reality of abundance in the form of a stack of warm, golden pancakes drizzled with genuine maple syrup, a luxury that had disappeared from German civilian life years ago. As the sweet aroma enveloped her, tears welled in her eyes. This was not the America she had been taught to fear and despise. This was something else entirely, something that would shatter her understanding of both her captors and her homeland. The journey that brought Helga and approximately 4,700 German women to American prisoner of war camps began years earlier with the escalation of World War II. By 1942, the German propaganda machine, masterminded by Joseph Goebbels, had painted a vivid picture of American society for the German population. According to official Nazi publications like Der Stürmer and Völkischer Beobachter, the United States was a crumbling empire of contradictions, simultaneously decadent yet impoverished, materialistic yet lacking true production capability, and racially mongrelized to the point of military ineffectiveness. German citizens were regularly shown carefully edited newsreels depicting breadlines in American cities, highlighting the lingering effects of the Great Depression. These images, many from the early 1930s but presented as current, reinforced the narrative that the American economy was fundamentally unsound and incapable of sustaining a prolonged war effort. In one particularly memorable propaganda film screened throughout Germany in 1943, titled Amerika, Land der Scheinwohlstand, America, Land of Illusory Prosperity, German audiences were shown supposedly recent footage of American children foraging for food in garbage cans, while the narrator explained that the Jewish-controlled American government hides its true poverty behind Hollywood facades. This propaganda shaped the worldview of millions of Germans, including women like Helga, who volunteered for service in the Wehrmacht Women's Auxiliary Corps. Helga, daughter of a Munich accountant and a trained nurse, had joined in 1941 at the age of 22. Inspired by patriotism and the belief that Germany was fighting for its survival against inferior but numerically superior enemies. Her training included not just medical procedures, but extensive political education on the nature of Germany's enemies, particularly the United States. She was taught that American soldiers were poorly equipped, undisciplined, and supplied with substandard rations and equipment. According to her instructors, America's industrial capacity was a Jewish Bolshevik fiction that could not possibly match the efficient German war machine. One training manual issued to Wehrmacht auxiliaries in 1942 stated confidently, "The American factory worker produces at 40% the efficiency of his German counterpart. Their assembly lines are plagued by strikes, sabotage, and racial conflict. Their production numbers are fabrications designed to demoralize the German people." The reality, of course, was dramatically different. By 1943, American factories were producing a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every day, and over 3,000 trucks per week. The Ford Willow Run plant alone was manufacturing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. When compared to German production figures, the disparity was staggering. In 1943, Germany produced approximately 10,900 aircraft of all types, while the United States produced nearly 96,000. In terms of food production, the contrast was equally stark. By 1944, the average German civilian ration had been reduced to approximately 1,500 calories per day, with much of that coming from bread and potatoes. Meat had become a rarity at only 150 grams per week, and coffee, chocolate, and fresh fruit had disappeared almost entirely from civilian life. Meanwhile, in the United States, despite rationing, the average civilian still consumed over 3,200 calories daily, with meat consumption averaging over 4 pounds per week per person. American farms were producing so much excess that strategic reserves were building, even while supplying not only their own military but much of the Allied forces as well. This was the world of contrast that German women prisoners of war were about to enter, completely unprepared for the cognitive dissonance that awaited them. The capture and transportation of these women to American soil is a lesser-known aspect of World War II history. Most were not combat personnel but served in auxiliary roles as nurses, communication specialists, administrative staff, and occasionally as anti-aircraft battery operators. Under the Geneva Convention, many technically qualified for prisoner of war status, particularly those in uniform serving with military units. The first group of 21 German women POWs arrived in the United States in December 1944, with numbers gradually increasing throughout 1945 as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. They were initially housed at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia and Camp Shanks in New York, facilities that had been modified to accommodate female prisoners while maintaining the required separation from male POWs. The journey of discovery began immediately upon capture. Margaret Voss, a 29-year-old radio operator who had been captured near Aachen in October 1944, recorded her first moments of confusion in a diary she managed to maintain throughout her captivity. "We were given chocolate by the American soldiers immediately after surrender," she wrote on October 12, 1944. "Not the ersatz chocolate we have known for years, but real chocolate with actual cocoa butter. They gave it freely, even casually, as if it were of no value. One soldier opened a pack of cigarettes, took one, and offered the rest to his comrade. Nearly a full pack discarded because he preferred a different brand. I watched in horror and fascination. How can they be so wasteful if they are struggling as we have been told?" This initial encounter with American abundance was just the beginning. As Margaret and other early captives were processed through temporary holding facilities in liberated France, each step brought new revelations. The American military police who processed them wore uniforms of startling quality. Thick wool, well-fitted, with sturdy boots that appeared new or nearly new. Their weapons were standardized, clean, and in excellent repair. Most shocking to many of the German women was the physical appearance of their captors. "The Americans are also large," wrote Ilse Weber, a former administrator with the 19th Panzer Division who was captured in France in August 1944. "Not just tall, but solid. Well-fed in a way we haven't seen in Germany for many years. Even their enlisted men look better nourished than our officers. How is this possible after 5 years of war? Their skin has a different quality, healthier, with more color. It makes me question everything we were told about conditions in America." The transport ships that would carry these prisoners to America provided the next layer of revelation. Helga Schneider and 64 other German women were transported on the USS West Point, a converted luxury liner, in January 1945. Although they were confined to secure areas of the ship, the simple fact that America could devote such a massive vessel to prisoner transport was itself revealing. More shocking was the food served during the Atlantic crossing. "For breakfast we received eggs, real eggs, with white bread and butter," Helga noted in a letter she would write months later to her sister. "I thought perhaps this was a special occasion, a show put on for new prisoners. But the next day, it was the same. And the next. The American guards ate identical meals, suggesting this was their normal ration. One guard left half his bread uneaten, and when I looked horrified, he simply shrugged as if this were nothing unusual." This casual American attitude toward food, the seemingly careless abundance of it, became a recurring theme in the accounts of German women prisoners. Ingrid Schultz, a 24-year-old who had served with an anti-aircraft battery near Hamburg, described her first meal upon arriving at Camp Shanks in New York. "They served us beef stew with vegetables. The meat portion alone was what a German family of 4 might receive for an entire week of rations. When one woman couldn't finish her portion, the American server simply scraped it into a waste bin. No one saved it. No one seemed concerned. I asked our guard if food was rationed in America. He looked confused and said, 'Well, sure, some things. Butter sometimes, sugar, but not like you mean.' I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For many of these women, the most profound shock came not from any single item, but from the relentless, day-after-day consistency of American abundance. Erica Miller, a 28-year-old former nurse with the Luftwaffe, captured in Italy in May 1944, described the psychological impact in a diary entry from March 1945. "It has been 10 months since my capture, and every single day there has been enough food. Not just enough, but variety, quality. The Americans consider this normal. That is perhaps the most devastating realization, that what we in Germany came to see as temporary sacrifice due to war, the Americans would consider intolerable deprivation. Their rationing would be our feast. Today I realized I have gained 12 pounds since capture. My body is recovering from years of what I now recognize was slow starvation, though we called it patriotic sacrifice." The question of how America could produce such abundance while fighting a global war became an obsession for many of the more educated prisoners. Greta Hoffman had been a mathematics teacher before joining the Wehrmacht Women's Corps as a logistics specialist. Captured in France in September 1944, she became determined to understand the American production miracle. Through conversations with guards, access to approved reading materials, and careful observation, she began to piece together the truth about American industrial capacity. "The production figures are not propaganda," she wrote in a notebook that was later preserved in the National Archives. "If anything, the Americans seem unimpressed by their own accomplishment. I have calculated that a single American factory producing canned rations generates more food in one day than my entire home district received in a month. The scale is beyond comprehension. The arrival at permanent POW facilities in America, brought these women face to face with perhaps the most psychologically devastating evidence of all, the treatment of regular German POWs who had been in American captivity for longer periods. By February 1945, more than 371,000 German prisoners were being held in the United States. Contrary to the emaciated, mistreated captives of Nazi propaganda, these prisoners were healthy, well-fed, and in many cases, notably heavier than when they had been captured. At Fort Oglethorpe, the women's POW facility was separate, but near enough to the men's camp that information flowed between them. What the women learned shook them to their core. Helga Schneider, whose pancake revelation began our story, recorded a conversation with Karl Brenner, a German infantry sergeant who worked under guard as a camp maintenance assistant. He has been a prisoner for 7 months, she wrote. He looks nothing like the prisoners I saw in our own propaganda materials. His face is full. His uniform has been replaced with American work clothes that fit his larger frame. He told me, we work 8 hours a day, are paid 80 cents in scrip, can buy cigarettes, beer, and extra food at the camp canteen, and receive the same rations as American soldiers, according to the Geneva Convention. Many of us are healthier than we were in the Wehrmacht. When I asked if they were being used for propaganda, he laughed. Well, the Americans don't parade us around or force us to make statements. They seem almost disinterested in us as propaganda tools. They just feed us, guard us, and put us to work. It's the simple routine that breaks you. The realization that this is normal for them. This normalcy, the mundane, everyday quality of American abundance, proved more effective than any coordinated propaganda effort could have been. The women at Fort Oglethorpe were housed in simple but adequate barracks, provided with clean bedding that was changed weekly, given access to hot showers with actual soap, and fed 3 full meals daily. The contrast with conditions in Germany, even before capture, was stark. Many of these women had been living with nightly air raids, increasingly stringent rations, and deteriorating infrastructure for years. In America, the lights stayed on consistently. The water ran clean and hot. The buildings were heated adequately in winter. These basics, taken for granted by their American guards, represented a standard of living that had become aspirational in wartime Germany. The most visceral evidence came through food. Breakfast typically included eggs, bread, butter, coffee with real sugar and milk, and often fruit or fruit juice. Lunch and dinner featured meat daily, vegetables, potatoes or pasta, and desserts. Special meals for Sundays and holidays were particularly shocking, as they demonstrated that even in wartime, America maintained cultural traditions around food abundance. The Thanksgiving meal served at Fort Oglethorpe in November 1945 left many women speechless. Hildegard Peters, who had been a secretary with the 18th Artillery Regiment before her capture, wrote, they served every prisoner a plate with turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, 3 different vegetables, and pie with cream. This for prisoners, while they told us our families in Germany were lucky to have potatoes. I could not eat at first. I simply stared at the plate while tears ran down my face. The American guard asked if something was wrong with the food. I couldn't explain to him that my tears were because the food was so perfect, so impossible. For some prisoners, this abundance triggered not gratitude, but initially anger and suspicion. Emma Fischer, a fanatical Nazi who had served as a communications specialist with the SS, initially insisted that the food and conditions were an elaborate deception. This cannot be how ordinary Americans live, she told her fellow prisoners. They are showing us a false prosperity to break our morale. Her denial persisted for weeks, until the consistent quality of life and conversations with American personnel of varying backgrounds confirmed the uncomfortable truth. Even then, she developed a new theory, that America would collapse after the war from the unsustainable excess of its production. This too would prove incorrect, as the women would later learn about America's post-war economic boom. The journey of discovery extended beyond food and basic necessities to medicine, technology, and infrastructure. Many of the women required medical treatment during their captivity, providing another window into American capabilities. Johanna Metz had developed tuberculosis while serving with a Luftwaffe support unit and was in the early stages of the disease when captured in April 1945. In Germany, her diagnosis would have been nearly a death sentence by that stage of the war, with medical resources severely rationed and prioritized for frontline casualties. At the Fort Oglethorpe Medical Facility, she received streptomycin, a relatively new antibiotic that was in extremely limited supply even in America. The doctor explained they had to request special permission due to the scarcity of the medicine, she later recounted. Yet they provided it to me, an enemy prisoner. When I asked why, the doctor seemed confused by the question. Because you're sick and we can help? That's what medicine is for. As if treating the enemy were the most natural thing in the world. The revelation of American industrial capacity became even more pronounced as the women were put to work in various camp roles. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted POWs could be required to work in non-combat roles, and many of the women were assigned to kitchens, laundries, maintenance, and agricultural labor. These assignments, intended primarily to keep prisoners occupied and to support camp operations, inadvertently provided intimate exposure to American logistics and supply systems. Helga Schneider was assigned to work in the camp laundry, where she encountered machinery that automated processes still done by hand in most German facilities. The washing machines are enormous and electric, she noted. They complete in 30 minutes what would take hours of manual labor. The amount of hot water and soap used for prisoners' laundry exceeds what was available for a German hospital. When a machine broke down, parts arrived the next day. In Germany, we had been told American production was crippled by their inefficient capitalism, that replacement parts took weeks or months. It was not true. Similar revelations came through other work assignments. Margaret Voss, with her background in communications, was eventually permitted to assist in the camp administrative office under supervision. There, she encountered typewriters, adding machines, and filing systems of a quality that had become rare in Germany. They have a machine that addresses envelopes automatically, she wrote in her diary. Hundreds per hour. The sergeant complains that it is old and slow, that newer models are much faster. I did not tell him that in my last posting, we had returned to writing addresses by hand because machines had broken down and could not be replaced. It seemed too humiliating to admit. Perhaps the most powerful work-related revelation came for those assigned to food service and kitchen duties. Ingrid Schultz was among those who worked in the Fort Oglethorpe mess hall, where she witnessed American food logistics firsthand. The deliveries come daily, she reported to her fellow prisoners. Trucks full of fresh meat, vegetables, milk, eggs, quantities that would supply a German town for a week. Once I saw the kitchen supervisor reject a shipment of potatoes because they were slightly sprouted. Food that would have been treasured in Germany was sent back as substandard. The waste is what haunts me most. Edible food scraped into garbage cans. In Germany, people would fight over what Americans throw away without thought. This casual American relationship with abundance extended to the guards and camp personnel, whose ordinary lives became subjects of intense fascination for the prisoners. Through conversations during work assignments and observations of off-duty personnel, the women began to piece together an understanding of average American life that contradicted everything they had been told. They learned that many of the young American soldiers had never been hungry in their lives, even during the Depression. They discovered that car ownership was common among working-class Americans, that many families had electric refrigerators, washing machines, and radios as standard household items. Most shocking was the revelation that many of the guards viewed their military service as a step down in comfort from civilian life, rather than an elevation of status, as it had been for many Germans. Frieda Schultz, a 26-year-old former administrative assistant with the 21st Panzer Division, befriended an American guard named Mary Jenkins, a WAAC, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, member who supervised the camp library. Through their conversations about books, a cautious rapport developed. She showed me photographs of her family home in Ohio, Frieda wrote in a letter that passed through censors. It was what we would consider an upper-middle-class house in Germany, spacious, with a garden and a car in the driveway. But she described it as just ordinary, nothing special. She is the daughter of a factory worker, not a manager or owner. When I expressed surprise, she seemed confused by my reaction. For her, this level of comfort was the baseline expectation for a working family. These personal connections provided context that statistics alone could not convey. The American guards and personnel were not members of a privileged elite enjoying special access to resources. They were representative of ordinary American life, a life that featured a standard of living that had become unimaginable in wartime Germany, and more disturbingly for the prisoners, had apparently been substantially better than German civilian life even before the war. This realization was particularly difficult for those who had genuinely believed in Nazi claims of creating a superior society. As 1945 progressed and Germany's defeat became increasingly certain, new waves of information reached the prisoners. Newspapers and radio broadcasts, carefully screened but still substantive, provided details of Allied advances, the liberation of concentration camps, and eventually Germany's unconditional surrender in May. The women's reactions varied dramatically based on their prior political convictions and their personal experiences during captivity. Some, like Emma Fischer, the committed Nazi mentioned earlier, retreated into denial and conspiracy theories. Others experienced nervous breakdowns as their entire worldview collapsed. But the majority underwent a more gradual process of reevaluation and reluctant acceptance. Helga Schneider described this process in a remarkable series of letters to her sister in Bavaria, written between May and December 1945, delivered after her repatriation. At first, I believed it was all exaggeration and special treatment to impress us. Then I thought perhaps America was depleting itself to maintain this illusion, surely to collapse after the war. Now I understand that what we experience is actually restrained by wartime limitations. America is not showing us its best. This is their normal, their everyday. What does that say about what we were told? About what we believed? I have gained 18 pounds since arriving 6 months ago. My hair is thicker, my skin clearer. I am a prisoner, and yet I am healthier than I was as a free woman in the service of the Reich. This is a difficult truth to accept. But I cannot deny the evidence of my own body. This physical transformation became one of the most visible and irrefutable pieces of evidence. Meticulous German medical personnel among the prisoners documented the changes in their own and their comrades' health. By October 1945, women who had been in captivity for at least 6 months had gained an average of 15 pounds. Chronic conditions related to nutritional deficiencies, including persistent respiratory infections, amenorrhea, and dermatological problems, had resolved in the majority of cases. Dental health improved dramatically once women received treatment from American camp dentists. These changes weren't the result of specialized medical intervention, but simply the consistent nutrition, reduced stress, and basic health care that was standard in the American system. The psychological impact of these physical changes was profound. For years, Nazi propaganda had characterized physical sacrifice as a virtue, linking bodily deprivation to spiritual strength and national character. Posters and publications had celebrated the thin, hard-working German citizenry, contrasted with images of supposedly soft, decadent Americans. The women's own bodies now testified to the falsehood of this narrative. Their improved health did not come with moral decay or loss of discipline. If anything, many found themselves more clear-headed and energetic than they had been in years. This directly contradicted the equation of suffering with virtue that had been central to wartime Nazi ideology. The overwhelming statistical evidence of American productive capacity became impossible to ignore as the war concluded, and more information became available to the prisoners. They learned that in 1944 alone, America had produced over 96,000 aircraft, compared to Germany's approximately 39,000 during the entire war. They discovered that the United States was supplying not only its own massive military, but providing substantial material to the Soviet Union, Britain, and other Allied nations through Lend-Lease. The numbers were so disproportionate as to seem almost absurd. America had produced 286,000 aircraft during the war years, compared to Germany's 119,000, 6,000 naval vessels to Germany's 1,400, and 86,000 tanks to Germany's 25,000. Helga Schneider, whose Pancake revelation began our story, encountered these statistics in approved reading materials available at the camp library. With her nursing background, she had a practical mind oriented toward evidence and observation. "These numbers explain everything," she wrote. "They explain why we never had air superiority after 1943, why our cities burned while American factories remained largely untouched. But the most important number is not about weapons at all. America produced over 33 billion pounds of canned goods during the war. Food in metal containers, precious metal that we could no longer spare for civilian use, produced in such quantities that they could feed not only their military, but millions of civilians in liberated territories. The pancakes that made me cry were not special. They were merely a tiny ripple in an ocean of abundance that we were told did not exist." The documentation of this journey from disbelief to acceptance appears in hundreds of letters, diaries, and recorded interviews with German women prisoners. Their testimony forms a remarkable chronicle of ideological collapse in the face of overwhelming material evidence. Margaret Voss, the radio operator whose diary provides some of our most detailed accounts, described the process. "It is like the stages of grief. First denial, this cannot be real. Then anger, we have been deceived. Then bargaining, perhaps there are explanations, special circumstances. Then depression, our sacrifices may have been meaningless. And finally, a kind of acceptance, not of defeat, which is bitter, but of reality itself. The reality that the world is not as we were told it was. That is a different kind of defeat, more personal and in some ways more complete." For women who had been true believers in Nazi ideology, this process was especially painful. Lotte Huber had been a dedicated member of the BDM, Bund Deutscher Mädel, the girls' wing of the Hitler Youth, before joining the Wehrmacht Auxiliary at 18. By the time of her capture in March 1945 at age 20, she had spent her entire adolescence immersed in Nazi worldview. Her letters reveal a wrenching process of disillusionment. "I was raised to believe that National Socialism represented the pinnacle of human social organization, that our temporary hardships were building a 1,000-year Reich of prosperity and strength. Now I eat pancakes with syrup in a prison camp and watch American soldiers complain that the coffee isn't fresh enough. They have no special characteristics. They are not supermen, not especially disciplined or intelligent. They are ordinary people with extraordinary resources, which means that what separated us was not character or will or racial destiny, but factories and farms and oil fields. All my certainties have turned to dust, and I am left with nothing but pancakes and confusion." Not all prisoners underwent such dramatic ideological transformations. Some maintained their political convictions despite the evidence around them, developing complex justifications for what they observed. Others compartmentalized, acknowledging American material superiority while still believing in German cultural or spiritual superiority. But for the majority, the daily reality of American abundance worked a slow, inexorable change in their understanding of both America and Germany. By the time repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, most had undergone a fundamental shift in perspective that would influence the rest of their lives. The lasting impact of this experience extended far beyond the individual prisoners. Upon repatriation to occupied Germany, these women brought first-hand accounts of American capabilities back to a population still processing defeat and struggling with severe shortages. Their testimonies, spreading through family networks and communities, contributed to a growing recognition that Reconstruction would require not just physical rebuilding, but a reevaluation of fundamental assumptions about economic and social organization. Many former prisoners found themselves in the awkward position of defending American policies and intentions to skeptical countrymen who had not shared their exposure to direct evidence. Helga Schneider returned to Munich in March 1946 to find her family living in a partially rebuilt apartment with irregular electricity and severe food shortages. Her improved health and appearance immediately set her apart from those who had remained in Germany. "My mother did not recognize me at first," she wrote in a memoir published in 1963. She had expected to see a malnourished prisoner and instead encountered a daughter healthier than when she had left. When I tried to explain about the food in the American camp, she thought I was exaggerating to make her feel better about my captivity. It took weeks of patient explanation and the testimony of other returned prisoners before she began to believe. Even then, she struggled to reconcile my experience with her understanding of how the world worked. "If they could feed their prisoners like that," she asked, "why do we still have rations?" It was a complicated question about occupation policy and European recovery that I was not equipped to answer. I could only tell her what I had seen with my own eyes. The influence of these women extended into the critical early years of Germany's post-war reconstruction. Having witnessed American industrial and logistical systems firsthand, many became advocates for economic liberalization and integration with Western systems. Some, like Margaret Voss, used their experience to build careers in the emerging West German economic administration. Voss, with her background in communications and her detailed observations of American organizational methods, secured a position in the transportation ministry of the developing Federal Republic. "Well, what I saw in America convinced me that Germany's future prosperity depended on adopting similar systems of production and distribution," she stated in a 1952 interview. Not simply copying America, but understanding the fundamental principles that allowed such abundance. Standardization, efficiency, consumer orientation. These were lessons written in pancake syrup and canned beans, but no less valuable for their mundane origins. Others took their lessons in more personal directions. Of the approximately 4,700 German women who were held as POWs in America during and immediately after the war, over 600 eventually returned to the United States as immigrants, many marrying Americans they had met during captivity. Helga Schneider was among them, returning to Georgia in 1952 and working as a nurse in Atlanta for the remainder of her career. "I came back because I had seen two worlds and made my choice," she explained in a 1971 oral history interview. "Not because America was perfect. I had seen racial segregation and other problems during my captivity that troubled me deeply. But I had also seen what was possible in terms of general prosperity, the potential for an ordinary life of comfort and sufficiency. That possibility drew me back more powerfully than patriotism or familiar surroundings could keep me in Germany." The story of German women POWs and their encounter with American abundance provides a remarkable case study in the power of material evidence to overcome ideological conviction. These women, many of whom had been true believers in Nazi propaganda about American weakness and inferiority, underwent profound transformations through direct exposure to the reality of American productive capacity. Their journey from disbelief to reluctant acceptance to eventual integration of this new understanding into their worldview demonstrates how ideology can collapse when confronted with overwhelming contradictory evidence. The pancakes that brought Helga Schneider to tears represented more than just an unexpected luxury. They symbolized the complete failure of an information system that had misrepresented fundamental realities about the enemy her nation faced. The legacy of these women's experiences continued to influence German-American relations throughout the Cold War period. As tensions developed between Western and Soviet spheres of influence in divided Germany, those with direct experience of America often became informal ambassadors for Western economic and political systems. Their testimonies, passed through families and communities, helped build the foundation of pro-American sentiment that characterized much of West German society during the post-war decades. When the Marshall Plan began pumping resources into European reconstruction, former prisoners like Helga and Margaret were among those who helped explain to skeptical countrymen that American abundance was neither illusion nor temporary aberration, but the product of systems that could be adapted to German circumstances. In the decades following the war, several of these women documented their experiences in memoirs, oral histories, and academic studies. Their accounts provide valuable insight into both the psychological dimensions of ideological change and the practical mechanisms by which abundance undermines propaganda. The pancakes, the casual waste, the taken for granted medical care, these tangible experiences proved more persuasive than any counter-propaganda could have been. As Helga Schneider wrote in the conclusion of her memoir, what defeated Germany was not just Allied military might, though that was formidable. What defeated the Reich's vision of the world was the simple reality of American pancakes served to enemy prisoners, reflecting an abundance so profound that it could be shared without strain even in wartime. Against such material evidence, no ideology, however passionately held, could long endure. The syrup of American prosperity dissolved German certainties more effectively than any bomb. Today, as Germany stands as one of the world's leading economies and a close American ally, it is worth remembering how this relationship was forged not just through high-level diplomacy, but through thousands of individual revelations like Helga's pancake epiphany. The transformation of enemies into allies often begins with small, mundane discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions. For the German women who experienced American prisoner of war camps, these discoveries came in the form of everyday abundance that contradicted years of careful propaganda. Their story reminds us that ideological conflicts are often resolved not through persuasive arguments, but through direct exposure to contradictory evidence. Evidence as simple and overwhelming as the smell of pancakes on an ordinary February morning in 1945.